Good morning.
Good morning. So happy to see you here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here in one piece and relatively whole. To answer the questions I've been asking, although I'll probably do this again at sharing time. The knee is better. I'm able to move around. As I told Sylvia, the one thing I do is use my cane to walk into school and out of school because they got a little bit of hill, and it's the downhill that gets me. Uphill with a bum knee isn't that bad. A little kind of tight, but that's about it. But downhill, you get those woo moments every once in a while, and that's no good. So that's the main thing I'm having to be careful about right now. It's just not losing my balance and falling down. So anyway, and then this coming Tuesday, I will do a cardiac consult ahead of my surgery, which is Thursday. And assuming that there's nothing unexpected in there, then the surgery will be on Wednesday. So I don't know if I said that right or not. Anyway, so as I said, I'll update that a little bit more during sharing time. But for those of you who are wondering, it's been a pretty good week for me, so I'm feeling pretty good about that. And we're going to get started with talking about the Sabbath commandment in the Ten Commandments. I say started, we've been talking about it for a while. We're going to pick up that discussion over in Leviticus chapter 16. So if you want to get out your Bibles, you're welcome to. I've got my scriptures up here, but those are the ones that I'm going to talk about. Some of you may want to talk about something else as we think about this, so feel free to call something out or to make a reference to something if you feel like it's something that is worth including. And I certainly don't have a what do you call it, a monopoly on all the good ideas around here. So okay, so we've talked already about the established. Well, first of all, we talked about the fact that the concept of the Sabbath predates the actual establishment of the formal Sabbath command in Exodus chapter 20. We see God resting on the seventh day, and we see then in Exodus when he goes and expresses the Sabbath commandment, he references his resting. And that strongly suggests, that coupled with the idea that the term Sabbath, when they used it the first time, was even before the commandment had been given, that the Israelites were part of a tradition that probably had some idea about the notion of a Sabbath rest, or a rest on the seventh day. Whether it was, a formal religious kind of experience, probably not, because there's a difference between God commanding it and just kind of generally having a cultural principle towards it. But it's likely that the Hebrews had at least some experience with that tradition in some way. And so when we talk then about the specifics, the first time we see the word Sabbath showing up in Exodus, it's before they've actually gotten to Mount Sinai. So the commandment hasn't been given yet to honor the Sabbath day. And yet, when they're talking about the manna and the manna distribution, that happens before Sinai, and God is talking about the term Sabbath in terms of don't gather any for that day because that's a rest day. So even though they have not formally created the law about the Sabbath of keeping it holy, God is already enforcing the principles of the Sabbath even before they arrive at the mountain. And again, the fact that there's no explanation of why he's doing that until the commandment suggests that the Israelites were at least aware of and accustomed to this idea, even if they didn't maybe get to practice it while they were slaves in Egypt, for example. And you would think, by the way, this kind of a little side thought that popped into my head as we were talking a couple of weeks ago, you would think that the Israelites would be pretty grateful for the idea of not having to work on one of the days of the week after having been slaves, because I'm guessing you don't get a day off when you're building the pyramids for the Pharaoh or whatever else. I mean, unless the overseers all take the day off, you're probably still out there working. So the idea of having one day a week that you don't have to do labor, that the camp doesn't move, and so you don't have to pick everything up and get it, from one place to another and set everything else up, that would be a pretty attractive idea, you'd think anyway. But then again, we flip that around, we think about ourselves today, and on the one hand, we if you work full-time, you cherish your weekends and your vacations, and then once you retire, for a lot of men especially, it can be very hard to figure out what to do with your time. And so for people who worked all the time, it might be kind of hard to disconnect from that for once a week, at least initially anyway. So, okay, so then the thing we looked at the beginning, or at the very end of last week, was this passage over in Leviticus chapter 16, where Paul talks about Sabbaths in the context of certain high holidays, or what would become known as high holidays. One of those is the Day of Atonement. So in Leviticus chapter 16, he says it's a permanent statute for you. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall humble your souls and not do any work. whether the native or the alien who sojourns among you. For it is on this day that atonement shall be made for you to cleanse you. You will be clean from all your sins before the Lord. It is to be a Sabbath of solemn rest to you, that you may humble your souls. It is a permanent statute. So he gives them a Sabbath day on the Day of Atonement. And he says that it's the day that atonement's going to be made to cleanse you. You're going to be clean before your sins. Now this is a really interesting idea, because we talk about the term rest, and when we use the term rest, what do we normally mean?
Sleep.
It's an hour.
Sleep. So if you're a parent, sleep, definitely. Sitting down, resting from work, stopping your labors, whatever it is. But I think it's really interesting how he talks about that it's going to be a Sabbath of solemn rest for you, that you may humble your souls. And I don't know how many of you remember the song that we have, and I don't remember the name of the song, but it has the phrase in there, you shall find rest unto your souls. And that's the reference to what Jesus says. I take my yoke, I am meek, and if you come to me, you're going to find rest for your souls. I think this Sabbath, more than any other one, and certainly tying into what Jesus says, is about the idea of rest from sin and from sin's effects. That your soul is at rest, at peace, not just because you aren't physically working, but because you actually have a day to stop and say, okay, this is the day when in a very physical, manifest way we can see the sin that we know is in us being taken away from us. And we now no longer bear that burden. Because sin is a burden. It's a burden. It's been a burden for all of mankind's history. From the minute that Adam and Eve were told what the consequences would be from their sins, all the way up to today, and it will continue to be a burden all the way through the end of human history. It is a burden that weighs us down as individuals. It is a burden that weighs us down as a people. And so here God is saying, on this day, you get a reminder that I am the rest from that. And Jesus says, I am the provider of that rest. And of course we know He's the atonement. So there's this perfect kind of alignment of these things that kind of set themselves up here. So this idea of a Sabbath on the Day of Atonement is one of the high holidays. I think it's the one that most, in a way, has the most symbolic significance. But almost all of the major holidays, all of the high days in particular, did have Sabbaths associated with them. Some of the other holidays that you see in there were not high days, and so we didn't necessarily have a Sabbath. But for example, and one of the most probably important ones for us from a Christian perspective, is what happened on the Passover. Because it's very likely, and I'm not going to go through right now today and try to do this because it's still confusing to me a little bit. But the Sabbath day would have that is referred to in some of the Gospels is very much more likely to be the Sabbath day of the Passover than a Sabbath day. And there's a place in one of the Gospels where there's the references seem to be referring to two different Sabbaths, and most likely what it's talking about is the Sabbath of the Passover day itself, and then the subsequent Sabbath that would have taken place at the end of the week. And so you don't need to understand those things to be able to understand the gospel. That's definitely not true, because I'm sure that there were a lot of Greeks that were very confused by some of that stuff. But it can be helpful to understand that when we look at the story of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, the Sabbath day stuff is probably talking about the holiday, and then subsequently about the actual seventh day of the week. But in any event, we know that the Passover was celebrated as a Sabbath, and so they would not have worked on that day. Let me start with Sylvia, and then I'll go back to you.
With that Sabbath, you said, Jesus died on Wednesday. He could not die on Friday and be risen on Sunday. But he died on a Wednesday, so he was at the Thursday was actually Passover, which is a Sabbath. After Passover, the first day after, is a Sabbath because it's first fruits. Then you have the Friday Sabbath, and then the Saturday Sabbath, the regular Sabbath. You have 3 Sabbaths there. That's why they could not go to the tomb or to the cemetery, because they had all those Sabbaths. They had to wait up till Sunday morning.
And this is the part where it gets confusing for me, because the problem that I have with that timeline is that Jesus is eating the Passover meal, which would suggest that he was doing it on the Passover, and so we have to find a redefinition of that terminology for that to fit that timeline. That is the easiest solution to the timeline problem of the sequence, but then we have to say, okay, so why did 3 of the gospel writers all say he ate the Passover meal, and only John writes it differently. And so, anyway, thank you though for helping us learn, because it is, I forgot about the first fruit Sabbath. So there are, one of the things with Jewish society, we make fun of the post office sometimes because they have so many days that they don't work. With the Jewish, it wasn't like there was that many of them, but when it got to the Sabbaths around some of those holidays, man, it's just like, wow, it just seems like there's just so many of them, because they kind of come together. And the thing that's interesting is, in the scriptures, there's no place where it says, oh, but since this might be a real problem for you, you can go to work if you want to. You might have some stuff you need to take care of because there's like 2 or 3 Sabbaths in a row like that, so just go ahead and don't worry about it. There's always this idea built into it of trusting God. That goes back to the manna situation with the Sabbath, where you gather as much as you need for one day, each day, until on the 6th day, where you gather enough for 2 days. And you trust God. Number one, that the manna is going to come every day. And number two, that you're going to have enough and you're not going to need any more. And so this idea with the Sabbath is very much not just about not working, but it's about trusting in God to take care of what is needed. And we're going to see in a minute here that it goes beyond just a Sabbath day sometimes, and you have to trust God over a much longer period of time. We'll get to that in a minute here. But, go ahead.
So Sylvia answered a little bit of what my question is, because I've studied this to where it's confusing. And
Right.
my question is like, yes, the high holy days are a Sabbath to themselves. Is it ever possible that it falls on a Sabbath? I think it
Yes.
is a separate day. Is it made a
No,
separate Sabbath?
count it, because it's always going to fall on a specific day of the month. That's
Right.
the rule. Every holiday has, like this one, 7th month, 10th day.
Right.
If that day falls on a Sabbath, then it would just be then what usually, a lot of times they would refer to that as a high Sabbath, because it was a regular Sabbath coupled with the high holiday as well. So you can have a double Sabbath basically on the same day, 2 of them that have overlapped with each other.
Oh.
Yeah, because your holidays are always going to fall on the date that they're called for, and if that happens to be the 7th day of the week, then it's that Sabbath. So
is that when it's called a high holy day?
Actually, this is one of those things, I'm not sure that we know the answer to that. I have read in some that when the term high Sabbath is used, it's referring to a Sabbath that falls on
Sabbath.
where the holy day falls on a Sabbath.
It makes the Sabbath to a high Sabbath because a high holy day falls on it.
There you go. Thank you. Okay. So yeah. So it's kind of the equivalent of, like, so for example, Easter is always going to fall on a Sunday because Easter is definitively a Sunday holiday. On the other hand, Christmas may fall on a Saturday or a Sunday, or you just don't know. It moves, and you don't relocate Christmas or Sunday just because they happen to fall together. Although there are some children who would very much prefer that you did, I'm sure, but you don't do it that way. So that's all of the Jewish holidays are set up in terms of a specific day of a specific month. So you would never have a situation where you could frequently have a situation where one of them overlaps with a given Sabbath day. So somebody else raised their hand over there. I thought, Jerry.
I was just going to say the Passover is on the 14th of Nisan, so I mean that is a specific day.
Right.
So it could be Monday, it could be Thursday, it could be Friday.
Right, exactly. And it doesn't matter what day it's on, you always celebrate on that day.
It's like your birthday, that
Yeah.
changes every year.
Okay, all right, so we have this, and like I said, we see this with all of the Jewish high holidays and with certain other things as well, that there's a Sabbath thrown in there to celebrate certain things. And it's usually, in fact, it's almost always something that is associated with a worship activity, a community activity, and something that is, when they're calling for a special Sabbath, it's almost always got some kind of a reference in here about thinking about God or thinking about something God has done. It's not just take a day off and just, go play video games or something like that. There's a very, that would be a very interesting thing for God to say. There's a very deliberate sense of, when you're taking this Sabbath off, here's what I want you to focus on. It's kind of like with our Lord's Supper. One of the things we like to have the men who lead that do is to kind of direct you towards a specific thought. We could just get up there and read the 1 Corinthians passage. Some churches I grew up or I've been around, they do that every week. They get up and they read the 1 Corinthians passage, and that's what we're going to do now. It's like, all right, well, great, thanks. I knew that. Been around for a while. But when somebody gets up and says, now I'd like you to think about, Jesus as the atoning lamb, or I'd like you to think about, this or that. Number one, it brings creativity into it, something maybe I haven't thought about before. Number two, it helps me to focus my thoughts down, so I'm not just generally thinking, okay, here comes the grape juice, let's not spill it. That's unworthy of the Lord's Supper, I think. But thinking about something more focused is important, and so that's kind of what God is doing here, is he's helping them to focus. Here's what I want you to focus on for this particular Sabbath. Sure.
It's reinforcing what you're talking about. There's at least a couple of times when Christ talks about the priests working on the Sabbath. But that's, again, that relationship with God that they're doing. And then he goes on another place and talks about if you need to circumcise your child on the Sabbath day, that you can.
Right.
I mean,
it's
that relationship with God.
And it's intelligent law building when you think about it. Any society that has a group of laws also has a way of prioritizing which laws are most important. And those priorities, in some cases, they may be obvious at the moment that you create the laws. That, for example, the protection of life trumps the protection of property. That might be an obvious thing. Not necessarily historically would that be true, but you might obviously build those things in, or you might have situations come up where you add them in. So you have a speed limit. The speed limit has always been enforced, and then there's some guy with his wife who's pregnant, is rushing to the hospital, gets pulled over, the police officer says, go on ahead, and ignores the rules because obviously the priorities are different there. There's nothing written in the law specifically about that, but the officer makes a decision, And so healthy societies with intelligently built laws have an element of the ability to be flexible with prioritization. And so God does that same thing with the Sabbath. And I think that's part of the reason why Jesus talks about the Sabbath not man being made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath being made for man, is because it was one of the ones that probably had more flexes around specific things, like the priests and like the Levites and circumcision and certain other things like that.
The donkey that falls.
The donkey that falls into the well, or the son. Don't forget it. If your son falls into the well, that's okay too. It doesn't say anything about your daughter, by the way. I just want to point that out to you. But in any event, it does flex a lot, because here again, we talk about this notion of rest. When you have things that are undone that you feel like need to be done, when you have crises that cannot be managed, there's a difference between trusting in God in the big picture and saying, okay, in this particular moment, he's not going to levitate my donkey out of the well. He's not going to circumcise my child for me. That's going to be an impediment to the effectiveness of the Sabbath. How are you going to rest when you're so worried about the situation or the need to do that? Now, some of that is learning how to back away from things that we think are important to say, okay, some of this stuff isn't as important. But some things are really important, and particularly when it comes to spiritual obligations. And so God is not trying to put the Israelites in a position where they're going to end up spending their Sabbath just nervous and freaked out about something they can't take care of until the sun goes down and suddenly they can run off and do it. That's not a rest. That's just pausing. So I think that's why you see a significant amount of that, is that resting requires a discipline, but also an ability, an opportunity to step back and say, I don't have to do something right now. Mark?
I was going to say, too, just like we read in the New Testament about the Pharisees, they took that completely wrong. Instead of focusing on God, they focused on the world. Okay, you can only go so far, when you're on a journey on the Sabbath. They completely missed it where God wanted us to stop and rest and think about Him and all the great things He's done for us. They were thinking about the world.
Right. What a hassle this is. How do we minimize
How
the
do I
impact?
get around this?
Yeah.
And so here, and at the start of this, when God started this whole thing off about humbling yourself and thinking about God, here He is, just that great teacher for us. This, think about it, get away from the world for a little bit, because guess what? It's going to be here tomorrow.
Yeah.
Think about God and try to get your thoughts focused where you should be thinking, and get yourself right again.
Yeah.
I think get yourself in that right place.
Yeah. Yes.
So Something just came to me in hearing everybody in your teaching is that how important this would have been in that age, because they didn't have the inborn Holy Spirit like we do today. So I'm seeing that maybe this was God's omniscience and everything to get these people to a point where they had to deliberately make that time meant to look to their Creator.
Yeah.
Where in our day and age, we've been blessed with the indwelt Holy Spirit.
But even still, we are called to make that time, to have that,
Yes.
you know, that connection is stronger and vastly more direct than it would have been for them. And yet, even still for us, there is that temptation to, you know, take it lightly, set it aside, and just do whatever we're doing because, you know, and so I think that the, you know, and to the flip side to it, for most of the people that he's talking to here, these are people who have seen God land on Mount Sinai. You know, I mean, you think about it, how many of you have seen the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind? There's the scene that's just crazy. I mean, the movie is this building up to this, where people are encountering aliens and they're having all these kind of supernatural experiences, and then at the very end of the movie, the alien mothership shows up, and it's this huge, amazing event. It comes and lands lands on the top of this bluff in Wyoming or something like that, and there's all this buildup and everything, and it's this huge thing. This is nothing compared to what happens when God lands on Sinai, you know, and it talks about all this stuff. They've seen Moses glow like a candle rod, I guess, or something like that when he gets done talking to God. They've seen miracles. They've seen the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. They have seen the presence of God. Literally, when they would stop for a while and they would set up the tabernacle, the presence of God, the pillar would actually go and sit and rest on the tabernacle. And they've won battles and they've had all these different things happening. And so they knew that God was in their midst in a very visual, experiential way that we don't get to experience God. But even so, they still need to be reminded every week, take some time to think about this. And I think that's sort of the parallel to us. We have the Holy Spirit in us, but we still need to be reminded, take some time to think about this. You know, don't just take for granted the fact that God is among you or in you now. You've got to do something from your side to maintain that relationship besides just saying, oh, it's great that he's there. You know, it's fantastic he's out there on that tabernacle. That's really good. You know, but I'm going to go ahead and go play video games. You know, we've got to be better than that. So, okay, let's go on to the next page or next passage here. So sorry.
Just if you want to do some reading on what Deuteronomy talks about for the rest. Go to Deuteronomy 12 and start with about verse 8 through the rest of the chapter, and it talks about what's supposed to happen on the Sabbath and why it's called a rest.
Okay, so for reference, if you didn't hear that, Jerry said if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 12, starting in verse 8, you can actually see a number of different discussions of what rest is and how that's defined in there. So I appreciate that. I don't think I have that in my notes here. I may have just overlooked that. So. Okay, so at Sinai, this is while the Israelites are still at Sinai. God says to Moses, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its crop. But during the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to your Lord. You shall not sow your field nor prune your vineyard. Your harvest after growth you shall, your harvest after growth you shall not reap. Your grapes of untrimmed vines you shall not gather. The land shall have a sabbatical year. All of you shall have the Sabbath products of the land for food, yourself and your male and female slaves, your hired man, your foreign resident, those who live as aliens with you. Even your cattle and animals that are in your land shall have all its crops to eat. So this is kind of this is huge. It's one thing to say, okay, 1 day a week, don't do anything. I can do that. You know, I can make arrangements to be covered for 1 day a week if I'm not supposed to do anything. But when somebody says to you, 1 year out of every 7 years, don't basically work, because for most of them, this is how they would work. This is a law that's being given long before the Israelites have become merchants and tradesmen and have started doing a lot of crafts work. There's a few craftsmen in here already, but the overwhelming majority of the Israelites are going to be farmers and growers, and that's it. Farmers and herdsmen. They're going to raise animals or they're going to raise crops. Anyway, so God says to them, when you get in there, after every 6th year, you're going to stop. You're going to stop. You're not going to sow your field. You're going to prune your vineyard. Now, how are they going to eat? What does it say?
Just like we do today. Now with what's going on in the world, some Christians get really jittery and afraid. But Jesus said, I will take care of you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. So did God, because in that 6th year it was doubled up, actually tripled, because till they could sow, it's 3 years, He provided for them. If they keep the Shemitah, the 7 years free, they had enough food, and they had enough food for the next period, year 1 again, when they did sow them, because it had to be food for 3 years, and they had it.
So,
And that's why they went to Babylon, because they didn't take the Sabbath year, the Shemitah. That's why it's 70 years, and it was because those are the Shemitahs that didn't celebrate, that didn't.
I have to tell you, when you started off and you said, just like today, I'm thinking they had grocery stores? How is that? And then you expounded very, very well, thank you.
We do not, you know?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting here, because there is this, this sense of, if you do what I tell you to, crazy as it sounds, it's going to work, and that's a lot of faith. To me, it's a little faith to say, don't do it for a day, because if I don't eat for a day, especially if I don't eat for a day, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to make it on through to the next day. I can promise you that. But if you don't eat, if you don't have food for a year, you're not going to get very far into that year before you're done. And yet He's saying to them, don't do it. And He says you're not going to reap, you're not going to gather, you're going to have a sabbatical year. Now, what He does say is that you have the products of the land for food. So this, I think, is the distinction between the idea of going out and reaping your land and the kind of thing that Jesus and His disciples are doing, where you're just walking along and what's available, you kind of take as you go. But the idea is everybody has that. So it's not like, oh, only I can go through and gather things on my life, because that would be reaping. It's basically, as people have need, as people encounter it, they just eat from the land. What's available, but beyond that then, what you have stored up, what you've planned for, and there's a process of this that you see also being carried out when it comes to the tithe. The tithe is not a thing where, for the most part, they get together once a week and they put some coins into a basket the way we do, and say and do that in a weekly kind of a fashion. The tithe in the Old Testament was a gathering together of products after harvest and taking them to Jerusalem to hand them over to the priests but not just Jerusalem, but primarily though, to hand them over to the priests and the Levites. And in the process, everybody got together and had a huge party, and everybody ate some of the stuff, and then all the rest of it went to them. And so for a year, then the next year, the Levites basically, and then the priests were primarily fed off of what they'd been given. So these Israelites, and maybe I'm talking to myself more than I'm talking to you guys, because I know a number of you have a lot more experience with farming and farm life than I do. But there is a tendency in our modern world to forget how farming works and how long you can plan if you have good conditions, and how long you can store things. And that's a lot of what's going on here, is the planning to say, okay, we're going to take a year off. Now, as Sylvia said, one of the problems with this was the Sabbath, temple worship, particularly these 7-year Sabbaths, but temple worship more broadly and the Sabbath more specifically were not particularly honored by the Hebrews most of the time that they were in the land. Over and over again, God criticizes them for not honoring His Sabbaths, for not following those expectations. And I think one of the reasons the Pharisees were so determined to try to set up rules about the Sabbath was because they were afraid of falling back into not doing it. And then they went too far the other way and turned it from being, let's make sure we don't mess this up again, to let's make sure we know all the rules and we create all the rules and we know exactly how it's supposed to work. And that's a mistake of its own, but the repeated violation of the Sabbath, people who go back, and historians who go back, archaeologists who try to find evidence of them doing this, don't find a lot to suggest that for a lot of the time the Israelites were in the land, they simply weren't doing it very well. It seems like what may have happened was that you had a period of time, first of all, when the judges were there, we know people weren't doing much of what they were supposed to do. There were some, and they would, when a judge would rise up, things would get better. And then you had Samuel, Saul, and David, and Solomon, and all of them, it appears, enforced and followed the Sabbaths and followed the temple worship and some of that kind of stuff. But once they go away, most of the time, the Israelites are not engaging in temple worship. Now maybe there's the priests that are still offering things, but the Israelites aren't really doing their job. And they're not really celebrating those high holidays in a very effective way, and they're not having the Sabbaths very consistently. And every once in a while you'll have a king who will do things better, but even there, the archaeology suggests they weren't doing it perfectly by any means. It's really not until the Israelites are taken away into captivity in Babylon, and particularly the people from Judah, that they come back, and Ezra and Nehemiah really institute the temple system, the priest system, and Ezra just hammers it into the people that they're going to have to do this. And from that point on, you see, and of course it helps us that at that point we're getting closer to what we would consider today relatively modern history. I realize that seems like a long time ago, but modern history is basically Roman Empire on, where you have some decent records being made. And that's where we start to see them consistently honoring the priests and following the Levitical priesthood models, using the temple worship, doing the Sabbaths, and a lot of those things, becoming a lot more scrupulous about the expectations of the law. But up until then, and we're talking about a 1,000+ year period where the Israelites simply were very lackadaisical with this. And when you think about the application to us today, and we talk about this idea of taking a rest and of taking time to get to know God, even with the Holy Spirit dwelling in us, it might be a little alarming to us to think about how lackadaisical the Jews were, and to question, maybe are we getting into that kind of thinking as well, where we just take for granted the relationship with God. We have our Sunday morning services, we have our friends from church that we love to spend time with, but at the end of the day, are we really spending much time actually thinking about God, or any of that kind of stuff? Because that was a major problem for the Israelites throughout their history.
Just an interjection, maybe, a thought, but that was the reason in the first place that they were exiled to Babylon, because they didn't keep their 7-year Shemitah of the rest of the land for 70 times, and so that's why they were. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's spelled out in the. Well,
Sylvia's referencing why the length was chosen, but it wasn't just that. The idolatry. Idolatry is the biggest one. The fact that they were constantly following after foreign gods. I think when you put all this together, and it's not surprising, obviously, if you're not following God, if you're committing idolatry, you're not going to pay much attention to Sabbaths, But idolatry, I think, was the core of what made God angry. If you go through and read some of the prophecies in Ezekiel, I would recommend that you not do it when children are around, because some of them are quite graphic, talking about the idolatry of God, or the idolatry of the Israelites, and comparing it to adultery against God. And when he talks about his relationship with Israel and Judah, and he refers to them as basically girls he came across in the desert who were on the verge of death, and covering them over and fixing them up, and basically, I don't know if you're familiar with the Pygmalion concept of Shakespeare, or the My Fair Lady concept is actually more likely for some of you, but the idea of taking someone that's not particularly presentable and turning them into these queens is basically what God says. And then, as soon as I got done with that, you ran off and went and found lovers from all over the world and brought them in and did unspeakable things with them. And that's basically how I see our relationship. Imagine that if you were a husband or a wife and your spouse was like that. You had, found someone who was not particularly lovable, and you put up with that, and you worked with that, and you got them to the point where everybody liked them, and then suddenly they didn't want anything to do with you anymore. That's kind of what he's saying. And that, when you read that, and you read the language that he uses to describe that, I think it's really hard to come away from that and not begin to understand what idolatry does to God and how offensive it is when he sees that happening. So I would argue that more than anything, why they were taken into captivity was the idolatry. They were not placing him first in their society. But symptomatic of that was not following the Sabbath, and the choice of the duration, he seems to have linked that to the Sabbath in the sense of just, of giving a number. And I've said this before, you've not been here before when I've talked about this, but God is a numbers guy. He loves numbers. He has all sorts of numbers that he 3, 7, 12, 10, all these numbers are numbers that he uses, and he very specifically will make things happen to make them coincide with numbers. It's fascinating to watch how he does that. So there is definitely an intent to make a relationship between the length of the punishment and what they were doing, but I think that what they were doing was part of a bigger picture of just absolute rejection of God in any meaningful way, except whenever something bad happened, and they were like, oh God, thank goodness that we're the chosen people, come fix it for us, and God, at some point God's like, I don't think I'm going to do that anymore, actually. I'm going to send some things that are going to mess you up. Steve?
The Sabbath, along with most all of God's laws or commands or guidances, to me, is to help condition the people. Because, as it said, the Sabbath doesn't benefit God, it benefits man. And why? It's not just a day of rest, it's because that's what we think of it. Oh, they just had to take a big break every week. But to me, the way the language used, it's a solemn rest and it's a humbling. And so it was to help condition the people to reflect on God. So it's really a day of reflection. And even though, you still had to do your dishes or whatever it is, take your donkey out of the well, but it was more or less to help trust in God more, reflect on Him, and all of that, because we need that.
Yeah.
We need that today. We don't have a Sabbath day today in the same way, but every day we should have faith and trust in God. And that's where most of us are very weak. I know I am. So it's much easier to trust in your own self. It's much easier to say, I can handle this.
Yeah.
It's much easier to say, I don't need to have faith in you today. Everything's fine. And I think that's what the Sabbath was all about, is to try and condition them into that faithful relationship with God.
There's a term you used there, I don't need you to, you didn't use this word, but the word control is what comes up to me. When what God asks from us, when He asks for faith from us, is the willingness to turn over control to Him. And we don't want to do that if we don't have to do that. We want to hold on to control because, as you said, even though I'm trying to remember, there was some movie I was watching where this guy talks about this. He says, if I tell you that there's going to be 100 Marines that are killed over in Afghanistan, well, not this was a little while back, but over in Afghanistan tomorrow, everybody's going to be like, oh, that's too bad, but nobody's going to freak out because that's what happens. If I tell you that there's going to be 3 shootings somewhere throughout the United States in the next couple of days here, and 3 people are going to be killed, everybody says, well, that's a tragedy, but that's what you're expecting. But when you do something unexpected, when something really bad happens that people aren't expecting, suddenly everybody just freaks out because the first one was what we expected, what we have control. We think we're in control of that because that's, we've got law enforcement, we've got whatever it is. When you are confronted with the reality that you don't have control, that's when people actually usually start paying attention to God. But until then, we want to maintain the illusion that our control is actually enough to make our lives work the way they're supposed to. We don't want to hand over the control to God. We don't want to have to accept that there are things that are outside of our control. And we definitely don't want to spend too much time thinking about the fact that things are not under our control. And so part of the Sabbath day is about saying to God, I know that things are not under my control. I know because I'm handing over to you a day and then later a year, I'm handing this over to you and you're going to be in control of this day. Hopefully you're going to be in control of all the days, but you're going to be in control of this day. And you're going to give me what I need, and you're going to get me where I need to be, and it's going to get taken care of. And if you, as you said, if you can condition people on a smaller scale to do that, then the idea is that it grows and becomes more effective. Now, again, what failed in the Jewish system was that they didn't do any of that. They committed idolatry, they ignored the Sabbath, and so instead of a cycle that would build them up and get them better and better, it was a cycle that just got them worse and worse and worse until God finally said, I'm done. you know. And then we have that reset when the captives come back from the land, and even that turns into something that it's not supposed to be because of the desire to control how it works. So the control thing has always been, there's a reason why pride is referred to as the kind of the core of the original sin. It's because the need to have control, to say that I can handle this, is central to most everything that we do that gets us into trouble in some way or another. So I saw maybe one other hand here. Was it Jerry or was it somebody back there? Whoever, oh, Jerry, go ahead. Jerry's like, I can come up with something if I need to.
I'm just really thinking about the verses that you've got up here and you know, looking at it from the farmers out there that can't go out in this field and plow, harvest.
And they're seeing people wander through and grab some food along the way
Yeah,
too.
he can stay in his yard and his barn and fix all of his traps and all of his all of his harnesses and clean out the manure that comes from the pigs and you know, there's still a ton of stuff that he can be doing and not violate God's law.
That's true. I mean, the Sabbath, part of the Sabbath is about preparation.
Yeah.
And using a day like a year like this, it's not that you have to be at rest all year. The land has to be at rest. There's definitely things that you can do. And one of the things, and I want to finish on this because we're out of time here, but one of the things where the first century starts to become problematic for the Sabbath rules, partly because of what the Pharisees are doing, but also because of the transition in the Jewish economy. So the Jewish economy up until, or during this period of time and through, certainly through the time that Ezra and Nehemiah come back, up through even, you know, as you close in on the 300 to 200 BC, is still pretty much an agrarian economy, farming and animal husbandry. But what starts to happen after that is as the Greeks and then the Romans come in, and Jerusalem and Judea is basically at this crossroads of these massive empires. It always has been, but they finally have two civilized empires that actually aren't trying to, first of all, they conquered everything anyway, but they aren't trying to, there's not a lot of battles in and around there because the Romans and the Greeks control them. And so suddenly there are trade routes that are coming all through there, and it becomes a very valuable, trading becomes a commodity, a major commodity. Craftsmanship, things like that. And so more and more Jews no longer raised animals, no longer farmed things. And in many cases, the other thing that happened was because of how bad their economy was, many Jews didn't own their own farms. They would work for hire for somebody else. So when all those things start to happen, it's interesting because of the effect that has on the tithe. Because the tithe, if you go and read the tithe, it's not about money. There are some, if you grow a bunch of stuff and it's so cumbersome to get it to market, or to get it to Jerusalem or to where the tabernacle or temple is, that you can't carry it all, you can sell it, and then when you get there you can buy replacements. But it's not about, at no place does the tithe talk about whatever percentage of the money that you've made over the years, because that would have been almost nonsensical to the Israelites as they stood at the base of Mount Sinai. What do we want with currency? I mean, the Egyptians would have had that to some extent, but they were a very advanced society by all measurements, pretty much, except spiritually. And so the Israelites, there was no provision for tithing. Now, there were certain things you had to pay. There was the tax, you know, circumcision, and there was the temple tax. There's a few things like that, but they were small amounts of money compared to if you were a full-time, if your job was a professional job, where you made money full-time, currency, you would actually have had to turn over very little of that to the government or through the tithe. And many Pharisees fell into this category, which was one of the reasons that it was easy for them to sort of lord it over everybody else, because they really weren't having to give a lot of what they got. Now they might choose to, and they make a big production out of it because they didn't have to do it, and ooh, how impressive, you know. But at the end of the day, they were really taking advantage of the fact that the system had changed. And when you talk about, you know, we talk about moving from Judaism to Christianity, and I've talked some about this before, the timing of this. Scriptures talk about that at just the right time these things happen. Part of this is that if you look at the system set up by the old law, it was designed to work in a specific set of circumstances. A nation that was a theocracy controlled by the people that served God, one that was agrarian by its nature, one that was where sacrifice could take place without the world condemning them for, you know, for something, you know, animal crimes or whatever else. the simple fact is that even if the Israelites had been relatively faithful in the first century, and the hearts of their leadership had been turned towards God, Judaism was a dying system because the system was not designed to move into the modern world. It never was. It was built by a God who knew something better was going to come along before, at that point. And so when we talk about some of these sabbatical ideas, they were also doomed to come to an end in practice as we moved away from some of those kinds of the centrality of agrarian life and some of those kinds of things. And so the Sabbath has to evolve. And the irony is that as Jews are so upset with Jesus in challenging the Sabbath, healing on the Sabbath, and going through a field and picking grains on the Sabbath, what they don't understand is that he knows what they don't know, which is that their system is dying. They might not be ready to accept that yet, but they should have by then. I mean, heaven knows there have been enough signs, but they're not ready to accept that, and he's trying to set them up for something that's going to be better, both in terms of the remission of sins, but also then how you practice your faith moving forward. And the Jews just can't see it because they're not seeing the big picture. I criticize them, but I have the benefits of 2,000 years of people thinking about this and writing things down and reading about them. So it's not like I have any right to say I would have had it better, back then. I have no idea. But the fact is the Jews are not ready to recognize that the system is ending and God has made it end. So we've got to stop speaking of ending because we're about 5 minutes over. Thank you all for your participation. Some great comments and thoughts. Next week we're going to pick up and talk a little bit about the Sabbath and translate it into the modern era, or into the modern Christian era.